Hello everyone. On the screen is an image, perhaps the most famous image of the Vietnam War. And it perfectly encapsulates the challenges of the poem War Photographer. In taking the picture, it raises the dilemma, are you doing the right thing? Should you be helping people, or are you doing the right thing in documenting what's actually going on in the world? This particular image, is an image which is evoked in the poem itself, and it's said by some to have brought about an end to the Vietnam War quicker than perhaps otherwise might have happened. So here we are about to launch into the poem War Photographer. Let's take a look at it. In his dark room, he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and the pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. You'll notice that for this particular video, I've already underlined the things that I'm going to talk about. If you wished to, you could pause the video and annotate it yourself. That way, then you could sort of check and cross-reference whether you've said something similar, bearing in mind that these are only interpretations and you hopefully would have your own ones. As is now becoming traditional, I will start with what the overall message, the beef, what's the agenda of the poem? Why has it been written? I think Carol Ann Duffy is seeking to expose the horrors of war, the horrors of conflict. And in addition to that, the internal conflict that arises out of the role of being the war photographer. I used the phrase dilemma earlier, and so I will use it again. I think the poem is also about distance, how we try to distance ourselves from what goes on around the world in terms of war zones and conflicts. How a photographer must distance themselves from what they are seeing in order to document it. I think the poem is also about indifference, the indifference that we the people, feel about conflicts all around the world. And it's a similar point to distance in some respects, but also increasingly, we see the indifference the war photographer has for those back home in rural England. So the poem is written by Carol Ann Duffy. Some students refer to her as the poet laureate, which is fine because she was the poet laureate, but she wasn't the poet laureate at the time that this particular poem was written. So that's a less interesting piece of context. In many respects, the interesting piece of context for this poem is that Carol Ann Duffy's friend was a war photographer. And so, similar to Simon Armitage in Remains, she sort of imagines the perspective of the photographer. Differently to Remains, it's still in third person. There's no I, it's still he. And so she is writing about her friend's experience as a war photographer. Let's go through it. And firstly, we'll have a look at form and structure. And we'll do this with something resembling an eye test. And what I mean by eye test is, I won't make you read out letters. It's more, what does it look like, the eye test? Well, what we should notice is that it's 4 stanzas, each with 6 lines, and it looks all the same sort of width. It looks really rather ordered. It looks ordered, perhaps, to mirror the order the photographer seeks. We must imagine, or we are encouraged to imagine, that a war zone is a place of chaos, a place of carnage, a place where calm is hard to find. And so the ordered, logical, formulaic, rigid nature of the poem is representative of the war photographer's desire for calm, for order, for logic. And if there is a pattern, it's this one, and you should write this down. We have 4 stanzas, each with 6 lines, with the last 2 lines of each stanza acting as a rhyming couplet. Mass, grass, depending on your accent, I suppose. Feet, heat, must, dust, wear, care. So the order represents the photographer's desire for order, the logic, the rigidity. Beyond that, this is a really emotive, I think highly affecting poem, which rewards understanding the words and what they mean. In his dark room, he is finally alone with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest, preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. Right, there's really rather a lot going on here. The first thing to do is to just clarify, and this is the same thing that every teacher ever did, is consider making sure that you know what a dark room is. And this is a dark room. In my hand, I hold a phone where if I want to take a picture, I take a picture and it just sort of appears. And of course, it wasn't always this way, and it still isn't this way for professional photographers much of the time. Not all of the time, but much of the time. And what do we notice about the dark room? Well, it's red. And this red light has a couple of different functions in the poem. First off, in his dark room, he is finally alone. So we can see here from the finally, that being solitary, being alone, has been desirable, has been sought after for a long period of time. What we have is a spool. A film of camera would be on a spool. If you're not sure what a spool is, Google it, of course, but you would also find like a spool of thread, for instance. And what do we notice about the spool of suffering? It's set out in ordered rows. And so the order is a sign of a desire for rigidity, a desire for calm, a desire for logic. And why is there this desire for calm, this desire for order and logic? Because presumably there hasn't been any up until now. The only light is red and it softly glows. And why is the light red? Well, partly because that's what the photography, the photos need in order to develop properly. But the red is on the one hand symbolic of blood, the blood that this photographer would have seen in the war zone, in the area of conflict, but also rather contrastingly, sanctuary. And we know this because we're told the light is red as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Well, what's the red light got to do with mass? Now, perhaps the only bit of other context that's useful for Carol Ann Duffy is to know that she was a Catholic. And so there is sort of an innate Catholicism that runs throughout the poem. And when it refers to a red light, it's referring to the idea of the little red lamp that sits outside what's called the tabernacle. So in the Catholic Church, the tabernacle is where the bread and wine are stored. And Catholics don't believe that when they are eating the bread and wine, that they're eating bread and wine. They believe that they're eating the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And we're going to come to that a little bit later on in a bit more detail. But the lamp, as you'll see, is specifically called a sanctuary lamp. And so we are seeing that for the photographer, the dark room is a sanctuary. He's being equated, he's being compared to a priest who is preparing to give a mass, to intone, to say a mass. And we are supposed to see how this red light is symbolic of the dark room, it's not symbolic of the dark room, how it is literally the colour in the dark room, which is potentially symbolic of blood, but potentially also symbolic of the dark room acting as a place of sanctuary. And then it has the further metaphorical connotations of Catholicism, of the photographer being like a priest. Belfast, Northern Ireland, site of conflict. Beirut in the Lebanon, site of conflict as a war zone. Phnom Penh, Cambodia, another site of conflict, another war zone. And we are told, and Duffy evokes what we don't call it because it is. She uses a line from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. Where it says, all flesh is grass. And what does that mean? It means all human life is impermanent. It's transitory. We're in transit, we're here and then we're gone. All flesh is grass. When we are buried, if indeed we are buried, our flesh eventually becomes part of the soil itself. All flesh is grass. It is therefore, and this is where it comes from in the Old Testament, the idea it's an eternal truth. So the first stanza depicts a person who is seeking sanctuary, who has been waiting for sanctuary, and now they are there. The second stanza, therefore, depicts a slight change of tone. He has a job to do. We might describe this as a very matter-of-fact statement. And we are told that solutions then slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Solutions here has a potential double meaning. If we return to the picture, we can see that the photography, the photos, are being placed into a solution so that the black and whites can develop. So there is a solution, a watery solution. But what else does solution mean? Well, it means to solve things. It means to fix things. So solution is the literal water to enable the film to develop, but it also is a fix. The war photographer has to think, look, if I take these pictures, maybe I can solve something. Maybe the people who see the pictures will be compelled to act. So we're beginning to see already the idea of distance and indifference being sort of pushed to the fore in the poem. In the first stanza, the photographer needs distance. He needs the distance from the conflict zone to try and make sense of what has been seen. He takes the pictures in the hope that people will be compelled to act. We will see their indifference as we carry on. When he took the picture, his hands did not tremble, but they are shaking now. So distance doesn't necessarily bring peace. Where is he now? Rural England. Duffy here seems to make, I don't know, I don't really know why we're being told it's rural England rather than urban England, say. I wonder if Duffy is trying to illustrate the sort of the home counties, you know, England and Britain as and the rest of Britain, I should say, as sort of cozy, cuddly. I think there's what we have, we can call this as an image of what you might describe as a pastoral idyll. Now, England is often described as, you know, Shakespeare and Richard II does it repeatedly, you know, it's God's land. It's a paradise. So now he's back in rural England, you know, which over the centuries has been described in literature as a kind of paradise. There's the sense that maybe all the problems should go away, but they don't. Home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, can make go away, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. And that line there is the one which is said to evoke this incredibly famous image of the Vietnam War. We can see running children in a nightmare heat. What are they running away from? They're running away from napalm. The ground is bursting into flames. So it's not just the nightmare heat of Vietnam, say, but the nightmare heat of napalm. The third stanza. Something is happening. Stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. And it's here that I will return to the idea of Catholicism that I think we have seen earlier in the poem. Catholics believe in the process and the concept of transubstantiation, where the body and blood that one eats is Jesus Christ. The priest intones his mass, he says his prayer, and in the process of that prayer being said or sung, what once was bread and what once was wine becomes body and blood of Jesus Christ. And that process is called transubstantiation, one that you perhaps have come across in your RS or RE lessons. Transubstantiation. How can we see it here? Because something is happening. And this word something is an interesting one because it's really vague. It's well, not jarring. We can call it jarring if you want, but it's It's unusual, it's atypical in the poem because the rest of the poem is really quite precise. The rest of the poem has language seemingly chosen 100% deliberately, imagery being really carefully crafted. But here we have the very vague language of something. And why do we use vague language? Usually because we can't articulate it any other way. We tend to be vague when words fail us. We are vague when words fail us, and the vagueness contrasts with the rest of the poem, which I'm just squeezing in there. The process of transubstantiation is incredibly vague, isn't it? You know, if you're believing that bread and wine becomes body and blood, we have to believe in a kind of something happening, but the something that happens being sort of impossible to define. We have a similar process with the development of the picture. It was in solution, it was slopping around, but now something is happening. What is it? A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. Really spectacularly emotive image. Why do we have a half-formed ghost? Well, one, the picture itself is half-formed. The picture itself is kind of blurry, smudged, not fully developed yet. But more affectingly, it affects us more, I think. It rather implies the death of the person whose picture he took, the stranger, who is now a half-formed ghost. Maybe we could say, slightly weaker interpretation perhaps, but it's half-formed because it's just a fragile memory. That's one of the reasons people take pictures, isn't it? It's to document things and to remember things. Even you with your families, if indeed you take pictures, it's to document what you did at that particular time, because otherwise you'd forget it. He can't remember the man, maybe. He can't remember the appearance of the man fully. What he does remember is the cries. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. That's a really interesting phrase, the idea of what someone must. Because again, it calls to mind the image of the priest once more. It's a vocation, it's a calling. He sees it as a duty. He is honor bound to take the picture. And again, I think we see the dilemma of the job being brought to the fore once more. He has to seek approval without words to take a picture of somebody suffering. How awful. How awful a thing to do. How awful to ask someone, but the other person just sort of agrees because they know it's also the right thing to do. Why is it the right thing to do? Because you are desperate for others, the people who see this, to act and to do something about it. What happens? The blood stains into foreign dust. Again, perhaps similar-ish to remains where there's a sort of blood shadow stained into the street. Maybe it's also symbolic of guilt. The fourth and final stanza. 100 agonies in black and white, 100 pictures in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6. Imagine that. You take 100 pictures of people suffering, and it just gets commodified. What we can see here is the contrast between how many pictures are taken and how many actually get used. But I think we also see the commodification of suffering. I think we also see desensitization. If you see 100 pictures of suffering, perhaps it ceases to become real. It just becomes pictures on a page. So we see the desensitization of the editor, and almost the desensitization of the photographer himself, who takes 100 pictures knowing that they're just going to be picked out. And what are they being picked out for? The Sunday supplement. So what is a Sunday supplement? This sort of thing. Look, I bought the newspaper the other week just to see what was going on in the world. It's your glossy magazines in the middle of the newspaper, not the sort of thing that you get on a Monday morning. You get on your Saturday and your Sunday, when people tend to sit down and relax, when they tend to look at the newspaper in a little bit more detail, when there is more room and more time for longer, more compelling stories. It's not just about a news dump, so to speak. So what's the effect of reading these stories in the Sunday supplement? The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. It's almost comic, really. What do? We cry. We back home in rural England cry at what has happened and what we see. But we only cry, you know, in sort of the middle morning. I'm laughing. It's not funny. I'm laughing because it's sort of, I think, really quite compelling as an argument. If ever you've watched Children in Need, Comic Relief, any kind of news story with people suffering, what's the effect? We go, gosh, isn't that terrible? Isn't it dreadful? If it's a charity thing, you might donate 5, 10 quid, £20 if you've got it. And then what happens the next day? I don't know, you carry on, get in the bath, have a beer, go and see your family, go for a walk in the park, and you forget about it. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. The key to this is that we are desensitized. We, the people back in rural England. But perhaps more interestingly, the fact that as he is on his way back out of rural England, back towards a conflict zone, he's on an aeroplane, he stares down at us impassively. He's not of us. He's not one of us anymore. He is almost distanced to us. So we are desensitized. We are indifferent because we forget about it. But now we see how the war photographer is rather indifferent to us. So to summarize, distance and indifference just been covered. The whole poem is about the horrors of war and the sort of dilemma, I think, of taking a picture in the first place. Perhaps what we are seeing more than anything is the conflict between being the person who takes the picture and being a person who just consumes the picture for a short period of time. We see the conflict between the, within the man himself, the one who has to take the picture. Is he doing the right thing? His desire for solitariness at the same time as being a person who goes back out to take the pictures once more. It being a vocation, a calling. He's doing a job that somebody must do. Overall, a really fascinating poem, a really interesting poem. I think a really compelling poem, and one that hopefully, as a consequence of this video, you feel a little bit happier to write about. We'll leave it there for this one. Until the next time, goodbye. Bye-bye, everyone.